This week, we're going to talk about initiative and is it a solvable problem? Can it be solved? What can we do about it? Let's get into the topic. We all know classic initiative. So here we have classic initiative. It's what you know from games like Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, and the likes. Everybody rolls their own value, and you get put into an order based on what you rolled, and then you get to play once. It doesn't matter if you rolled a 35 on initiative or a 2, you get to play once. Once your turn is over, that's it. You may get a reaction, you may not. And then when the next round comes around, it all starts again in the same order. There you go. Classic Initiative has its own problems. We'll get more into the drawbacks later. Now, Group Initiative, it could be similar. There could be maybe an averaged initiative, so everybody rolls, but you average it out. Maybe you take the highest of each team. Maybe there's only one person who rolls. Currently, I'm playing Knave. It uses group initiative. Not a big fan of it, but I'm thinking there's some things you can tweak about it to make it better. So one person rolls, the leader rolls, and then whoever among the two rolls higher, that whole team gets to go first. Has some big issues. For example, let's say regardless which team goes first, then they have the chance to already knock out one or two creatures on the other side, making the combat really one-sided. It becomes all about who wins initiative, pretty much. Next, Last Stand. This is somewhat innovative. For those who've played the video games Banner Saga, you would recognize this. So what happens is you are playing with alternate initiative. That means it's somewhat like classic. So you have a certain order, but it always makes sure that it is alternating. So you have the first ally and then the second ally. But then as creatures die, your initiative order kind of thins out. So you could imagine that here in the middle, there used to be an enemy, and here between the two allies, there used to be another enemy. Then, as they die, the combat, there's a snowball effect. Because these gaps in the initiative order do not get filled, so overall, the more you kill, the more your team is favored in the action economy. Which, is fair, right? You've managed to bring down a creature, so it's expected that you'd be winning or winning more. However, things start to become very different once there is only one enemy left. In this kind of initiative system, then the last enemy, in this kind of enters this last stand mode, almost becomes like a legendary creature and starts filling up every slot in between allies. So now, let's say there were 5 allies. Now suddenly, this one enemy has its action economy quintupled, so multiplied by 5. Does it make sense? I don't know. It's cool, like you trying to bring out the last enemy. It becomes super tough because they're playing so often. But it can feel really sucky if then suddenly this one enemy who now has 5 times the number of actions wins. So definitely, I should say, when you have certain creatures or monsters or enemies and you expect them to have a certain power level, a certain strength, a certain way of behaving, and then all of that gets upset, it doesn't feel great. Because if you have a ginormous dragon, you'd be expecting, oh, that's a legendary creature. Of course, it makes sense that it gets to play in between turns. But if it's a random bloke, maybe not. Maybe not. And it also creates some kind of meta behavior. Because then in this last stand system, you'd be incentivized to keep 2 enemies alive until the very end, and then in the same turn, down both enemies. That way you never activate the last stand. So, not very organic behavior. Good idea, but maybe poor implementation. Now, segueing into that, the legendary creature is kind of like Last Stand, but all the time. So you have one big creature, and because of its nature, it's supposed to have a more strength, a higher power level. So therefore, it does get to, because it's asymmetrical by nature, it does get to play in between every ally, because every ally is just one character, one hero, and this is a very powerful creature. So it, in the narrative, in the whole, balance of things, it does make sense. It is expected. It is telegraphed. The problem comes into play when you have minions and other creatures. What do you do with them? How do you interlace them into the initiative? Well, I would say you could have a normal initiative. So, for example, classic, which in a sense is kind of what Dungeons and Dragons is trying to do with legendary actions. You have a classic system, but the epic dragon or legendary creature or whatever, it gets to play still in between turns at its leisure. And it's kind of the two systems coexisting at the same time. So what this could look like is, here you have the legendary creature that gets to play in between every ally turn, but then maybe in some places, wherever the little kobolds or goblins or whatever would play otherwise, they still get to play. However, that becomes a very fine thing to balance and to tune. Moving on, this is maybe not a whole system on its own, but an iteration, more reaction. So in a lot of systems, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder and so on, you get one reaction. Some systems don't give reactions at all. Now, wouldn't be interesting if you could choose more or less when you get to play, or what actions or what you get to react to, then rather than just having one reaction you have to hoard? And maybe you have a class feature that relies on your reaction, and therefore all you're doing, maybe you're playing, that's why in Pathfinder, some classes, some features give you more reactions for specific things. For them, oh, you have this reaction, you can only use it to shield block. I think that's good. Still, the whole system is flawed inherently, but it's good in the sense that players will not feel forced to hoard their reaction because they are like a paladin or whatnot, and they feel like they need to shield block because that's their thing. It's really powerful. They need to save it, and then therefore all the other reactions that they could possibly be doing, they can't anymore. Now, what if reactions were a common currency? So, or you could interchange actions with reactions. Let's say you have a multiple action system. So, like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you have 3 actions, but instead it could be 3 actions or reactions, and they could more or less all be the same. So maybe whether you have a group system or a classic system or an alternating system, then you could choose, hey, I have these 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever number of actions / reactions, since they're the same, and I can just choose when they happen. So, oh, the powerful dragon did this thing. Well, I'm going to use this reaction because it's an appropriate moment. It could create a lot of issues in the sense that if you have 5 players who are then suddenly all trying to take their reactions at the same time. But I feel like it would be worth exploring. More on that probably in another video. Now, we have finally, but not quite finally, we have value-based initiative. What does that mean? So you can see I put this horizontally, the boxes, but overall the initiative timeline vertically because it's easier to show. So what happens is, in systems like Shadowrun, you roll a number for your initiative. So for those who are more used to regular initiative, you can still roll a d20 with an initiative, and you have a value. So in Dungeons & Dragons, you may roll, anywhere between, 1 and 30 or whatnot. And then, instead of it just being a number, it is a value that you decrement every round. Or I should say more every time you play, your character plays. So that means if you rolled a 30, you'd get to play more than someone who rolled a 5. Some of the issues then becomes in the balance. if let's say you used a D20 for this value-based initiative, then how much would the decrement need to be? Should it be 10? Well, that could create some issues because certainly the person who rolled a 30 on their initiative gets to play 3 times as much as the one who rolled a 10. So the one who rolled a 10, they only get to play once because they play once it comes to a round to the number 10, but then after they play, it gets decremented by 10, so they reach 0, their round is over. Whereas the person who has rolled a 30 gets to play at 30, gets to play at 20, and gets to play at 10, so 3 times. Is that fair? I don't know. That's why you need to tweak the value. Maybe having it being decremented by 20, for example, since you roll a d20. And then the nature of rolling a d20 for initiative would be questioned in the first place because there's such big variance. So maybe you would need a stat, right? Something like that. It gets quite tricky to balance. A lot of design work needs to be put into a system like this, but nonetheless worth exploring as well. There is a lot that could be tweaked with this, a lot of gears to be turned. I think I would like to see more system. If anyone in the comments knows systems that are not Shadowrun that use this kind of value-based initiative, I would love to check those out and learn from them. One of the major flaws of this value-based initiative is that then it becomes the most important stat, whether you have your strength or your might or whatnot. Suddenly all of that becomes a little bit secondary because whether you do 1 damage more than your friend is not important if you get to play twice as much. So suddenly action economy, if you have a stat that is indirectly responsible for action economy, that becomes really dangerous with the balance. Another question surrounding fairness of a value-based initiative is, do you keep the same number every round for the whole combat? Then that initial roll becomes super important, maybe too important. Or do you re-roll every round? That can create a lot of additional rolling, could be interesting, could be not. The more I think about it, the more I feel like there will probably be a future video on testing out and tweaking a value-based system because it could be the key to solving all of our, initiative system. I'm still not decided as to what really, maybe it's a mix of all of those. What about a value-based system? I think they may already do that in Shadowrun. Depending on what action you take, it decrements your initiative differently. If you'd had a really big or slow attack, it might decrement the initiative more than if you had just dashed, for example. And this could marry itself really well with the more reaction system, where reactions are action in the same thing. You want to take a quick dash behind cover, that's going to be cheaper than taking a big swing or unloading the whole magazine of your gun, whatever, fantasy or sci-fi system you use. And there could be a lot of strategy involved into that. So the more I talk about it, the more I'm kind of falling in love with this value-based system and with this more reactions, or maybe I should call it reactions are actions initiative system. Lastly, and this is the real finally, is free flow. Now, this is not meant to be a diss for free flow initiative systems, but there is nothing. Why? Because it's free flow, so I can't model it, but it's things like Daggerheart, which are a bit of a kerfuffle. It's you play when you want. I think everybody knows the issues inherent with such a system. And you are more relying on the cooperation of your players. I think there's a lot of great cinematic and narrative boons to such a free flow system where players can kind of craft the scene themselves. However, it does need players who know each other well, are able to cooperate, and are used to improvising and telling these stories together. So definitely not for every table. You would need more a table that is already established and that you know works well together. But since there aren't a lot of rules inherent to free flow, I mean, it's literally you play whenever you want to play. Not a lot of rules to discuss, not a lot of design space here to explore, unless you think otherwise. If you have some insight into these free flow initiative systems that I don't understand, then let me know in the comments.